message from our sponsor, the Royal Literary Fund.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves a chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak with the novelist Paula Hawkins.
We spoke to Paula about moving from financial journalism to writing fiction, experiencing huge global success with The Girl on the Train, and her latest novel, The Blue Hour.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Paula, welcome to the podcast. It's excellent to have you on Always Take Notes. We wanted to start with The Blue Hour, your new novel set on a fictional and remote Scottish tidal island. Could you tell us where the idea first came from?
So the island I've been thinking about for a long time. I went to France in 2017 to Brittany, and I was spending some time on the coast there. And there are a lot of little tidal islands off that coast. And I remember walking on the sand one day when the tide was out towards one of these islands and noticing that on one of them, there was a tiny house, just one house all by itself. And I really had that feeling that you get sometimes when you think you've got the idea of something, or the start of something, that kind of little tingle that you get. And there was lots of things about it. It was obviously it's beautiful, it's lonely, it's remote, it's got locked room possibilities because of the tidalness, because you could be cut off there, you could be trapped there. But there was also this thing I was wondering about the sort of person that would want to live in a house like that and what it would take to live like that, what kind of person you would be. So that's kind of where it started. I then moved the setting, obviously, to Scotland. I didn't want it to be France. I wanted it to be sort of cold and stormy and Scottish. And I decided that it would be an artist that would live on the island, because that was the perfect place. Someone who wanted to be cut off from the world, to devote herself to her work, and who would be attracted to that kind of landscape and that loneliness.
And so once you decided to transpose the setting to Scotland, did you go and do kind of on-the-ground research for the setting?
Yeah, I mean, I have a place in Edinburgh that I spend quite a lot of time in, and I travelled out to the West Coast a lot. I love that coast, down to Kintyre or up to Skye or the Outer Hebrides and Sutherland, even further north, and took loads and loads of photographs and made loads of notes and just walked on the beach and soaked up the atmosphere. It is very fictionally kind of inspiring, that parts of that coast. So yeah, I did spend a lot of time out there walking and thinking.
And you've said elsewhere that with your process generally, you start with a character as the point of departure. How do you go about creating these people?
There's usually at least one person, and in The Blue Hour, it's the artist, Vanessa. And they've been living in my head for a long time before I actually get to putting them on the page. So I'll have been thinking about a person. They usually I'll start with just one trait or one aspect of them that I find interesting. And then I sort of build around it. And with Vanessa, I decided I wanted to write about an artist who makes things out of broken things. And that came in quite a long, sort of convoluted way. That I'd been to an art exhibition at the Barbican and the work of Lee Krasner, who's an abstract expressionist, and she at one point in her life she painted work. She then decided she hated it, literally ripped the canvases up, abandoned them, and left her studio, and came back months later and looked at these canvases, and something came to her, and she ended up making collage out of the the ripped up canvases. And I loved those pictures. And I was just interested in that idea. At the time, I was writing a novel which was going nowhere. And it was that awful feeling where you just can't make something work. And I was abandoning it. I decided then to abandon it. But I salvaged things out of it. And so it was that idea of salvage. So this is a very long answer, sorry, but that's kind of where Vanessa started. Somebody who makes things out of broken things. As when you read the novel, you'll find that that's not in any way central to her. But it gave me a departure point. And from there you think, well, why? Why is she doing this? What's happened? How did she come to this point? And then you start building. That starts to give you, a story for someone, a backstory, a picture that you can start with. So yes, one trait or just one peculiarity, and then I go from that and I start building around it.
It's funny that you mention the similarities or the resonances with writing a novel, because as you were saying that, I was thinking it feels like the writing process of having things thinking about starting again, combining. And then when you build story around someone, I think I've seen that you don't plot your novels out start to finish before you start writing, but you do have a kind of fabric covered notice board that you put ideas and points on and kind of move things around there. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think about story?
So I generally have when I'm starting a novel, I need to know, what the end point is, and sort of. With a crime novel, kind of whodunit, really. You need to know what the solution to the main central mystery is. Who is that? Who is the culprit, or what have you? Because that gives you something to aim for, and because it would worry me if I didn't have that it somehow wouldn't work out. So, but that's sort of all I like to have, because I find that my best ideas and my best writing comes when I haven't restricted myself. So, and you start, when you're in the novel, you start making connections, you start seeing connections between characters or themes or things that I could never possibly have come up with at the beginning, because I'm not in the novel yet. So, I won't start with a plan, but I will start with a vague arc and an end point. However, there's generally a point around, I think probably a third to a half, well, probably nearer to halfway through the book, where I will find that I need to take a step back, put a bunch of Post-its on a board or a bunch of things on a board, and so that I can see the shape of how the novel is. You can't really see it when you're writing the book. You can't see the shape of the story, and you need to see those points where where the pace might be slacking, or where you haven't heard from someone for a long time, they've sort of dropped out of the story, and that's always, so that's when the actual sort of most detailed structural planning happens, is kind of halfway in, because then I kind of know more about it, and I can see that shape developing, and that I think is very important to see, to get the shape right.
Having touched on whodunit, we wanted to hit a sort of another classic trope of the crime novel, the art of the twist. We saw this quote that you said that if the twists are earned and the plot is clever, then the who of the murder is less important than the why. So how do you go about creating surprise?
I don't think about it too much at the beginning. I think you have to, again, those twists, they need to develop almost organically. I think over twisty plots start to feel very forced and very unlikely, and I find that sort of slightly annoying as a reader if you can kind of see the work going on. A good character never feels forced in that way. The twist, I think there'll be moments where you, as a writer, know that you can mislead and you can misdirect, but not in a very obvious, here's a red herring way. It needs to come. I do feel that feeling of earning something, of laying the groundwork slowly, carefully through the whole novel, so that if someone is really, really paying attention, they might be able to see what's coming, but hopefully they won't be paying attention that much. And so it's a surprise for them, but they also have that sense that, oh yes, this makes sense. I've seen that this was coming. And they look back on the novel in a different way. And that's really a good twist, is when it makes you suddenly reconsider everything that you've read. And that isn't, again, something that you can necessarily plan from the beginning. It's something that you develop as you feel your way into the story.
Yeah, I think in screenwriting they call it the expected surprise.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps in reference to this novel, I mean, what's the editing process like for you? If you're kind of halfway through taking stock of the story and where it's going, and also kind of building as you go along, how long does it take you to kind of put the whole thing together from beginning to end?
Well, the writing process, it really depends on the novel. This novel, I wrote it quite relatively quickly for me. I guess it was about a year in which I wrote the book. And I think it was a pleasure for me to write because I think the plot elements fell together quite neatly for me, which meant that I didn't have to spend that much time on that side of things, and I could spend more time on the language and refining the language, looking at it from the level of the sentence, which is a pleasure for the writer. And it's something that I've not always found the time to do. Because often my novels are quite intricately put together, and I kind of seem to have spent too much time on plot and structure and getting all my ducks in a row, and not enough time on the actual language, which is the thing that you want to spend the time on. I mean, edits can take forever, can't they? There is a certain point at which you have to just hand it over to someone else. But there is real pleasure, I think, in the actual line edit that you do for yourself when you go back and you refine the language and you make sure that your sentences are surprising or concise or lyrical, whatever it is you're aiming for.
With the Scottish setting, did you have any other particular writers in mind? We've had Ian Rankin and Val McDermid on the show, Scottish kind of crime writers who are so rooted in that. Mila, I was also thinking with that Hebridean setting of something like Compton Mackenzie or Whiskey Galore or anything like that. Were there any sort of literary touchstones that you had in mind with building that world?
I mean, oddly enough, there weren't really specifically Scottish writers that I was thinking about. I think the person who I thought about and who's mentioned a bit in the book is du Maurier, and there's various reasons for that. It is partly the sort of the spooky remote setting, but there's also this notion of a figure that looms large over the book, but who is no longer with us, as from which we know from Rebecca. But also there was this sort of, I had been reading some short stories of du Maurier's, both of which we know very well from movies, The Birds and Don't Look Now. And those were both touchstones for me in terms of the atmosphere, particularly of The Birds, that very foreboding, terrifying atmosphere. The story is much scarier than the movie. And that sort of the vague sense of unease and disquiet that you get in Don't Look Now, not the actual terror, but there's more a sense of unease and superstition that runs through the whole of Don't Look Now, which is what I was also trying to inject into this book.
And you mentioned earlier the idea of a tidal island being a bit like a locked room mystery as well. Was Agatha Christie an influence on some level?
I mean, I loved Agatha Christie as a child. As a young teenager, I guess, is when I discovered her. And there is a real pleasure in the plotting, I think, of an Agatha Christie, of how clever it is, how well it fits together. The locked room thing, it gives you certain parameters. People know, where it is possible to be and impossible to be at certain times. And there is real pleasure in something like that. So yes, she was definitely an influence. She was definitely the first person that got me interested in crime writing.
Talking of childhood and your reading as a young person, we wanted to come back to the new novel in due course, but could we roll back now to your early life? So you grew up in Zimbabwe. Could you tell us about that and about your kind of initial interest in books and in reading?
So I lived in Zimbabwe until I was 17. I was a big reader as a child, but not a highbrow reader. There was a lot of Enid Blyton and that kind of thing. I mean, you read, the thing is, it's a strange thing to grow up in a place like that, and all the literature you read is very European. It was for me anyway at the time. And I read Enid Blyton and the kind of fairy tales that we all read, and a little bit of American stuff as well. But mostly it was, Beatrix Potter and The Tiger Who Came to Tea and all that kind of thing. And so it was quite extraordinary for me when I actually first came to the UK to see the landscape. I very clearly remember coming to Edinburgh and being absolutely gobsmacked. There was a literal castle on a hill. I had, this was for me the stuff of storybooks. I didn't realize that these things actually existed. So I was a big reader, loved going to the library. But as I say, I wasn't one of those children who sort of read all the classics or anything like that, I'm afraid.
We're yet to have someone on the show that admits to reading all the classics as a child. It's very much more in the Enid Blyton, Agatha Christie vein. I saw somewhere that you said you've always had a slightly morbid, macabre imagination. Was that from childhood as well? Were you reading quite dark stories like Roald Dahl and the like?
I loved Roald Dahl. I remember, reading the Tales of the Unexpected. The stories, they're such clever stories, and they're so funny as well, but they are really dark, and I liked dark fairy tales. And I think I always seem to be fascinated by rather gruesome stories, and stories that people told you in life as well. I was always fascinated by the darker ones. But my mother grew up on a farm. This would have been in the 50s, in what was then Rhodesia, and she had lots of really quite frightening stories that she told from that time. I think it was quite a frightening time for her. It was just her and her mother on the farm, and those really stayed with me, and they still stay with me, and I think about them a lot. So that definitely drew me. I was definitely drawn in a particular in a particular direction, despite never having, my own personal childhood was very sunny and nice, and nothing terrible ever happened. So.
You've said that when you moved to the UK at the end of the 1980s, it was a fairly discombobulating experience, and that people assumed you were South African from the accent and stuff like that. Tell us about that process, and what happened to your accent, and how you began to build a life and a career here.
Yeah, so I moved in 89. My parents came over briefly. They then went back. It was difficult, I suppose. Obviously, you're 17. I had loads of really close friends in Zimbabwe, and it was a wrench to leave them. And then I came here, and I was excited to live in London. I really was. Zimbabwean society was fairly conservative, and I was really excited about being somewhere like London, where there's all this culture. And I had this idea that everyone was terribly progressive and left-wing in the UK. I don't know why I had that impression, but I did. And I was excited about being in that milieu. But I was also very lonely. It took me a long time to make friends. And I have talked about dropping my accent, because 1989, every time I opened my mouth, people assumed I was South African, and everybody did not like white South Africans with some justification in 1989. So I sort of, as you do at that age, trying to fit in, drop my accent. Sounded terribly British. It goes kind of all over the place now. But it took me a while. It took me a while to find my place. But I think that period of loneliness and feeling like an outsider and feeling like I didn't belong anywhere was very useful later on. It's useful as a writer to have those kind of periods where you feel on the outside and you watch what's going on, and you kind of have that sense of longing that I think has turned up in a lot of the books.
Is it a feeling that even now, with many years distance, you can tap into and access quite readily? Yeah,
I can. I do think that stays with you. And also that sense of not quite belonging anywhere, which I think a lot of people have if they've moved at a key point in their lives. That I'm not properly British, although I have a British passport, whatever, but I'm not Zimbabwean either anymore. And it's that kind of dislocation. It's not a huge hardship or anything, but it is something that you feel about yourself.
Can you tell us about your move into financial journalism, how that came about? And at one point you were deputy money editor at the Times, right?
Yes. I also, growing up in Zimbabwe, I knew, well, my dad's an academic, but he also wrote for some of the papers. He wrote for the Financial Times, he wrote for the Economist. He knew lots of journalists. They used to come and stay at the house. They were really sort of, to me, glamorous, interesting people who'd lived these incredibly exciting lives and been to incredibly exciting places. And that was kind of my dream of it. Unfortunately, by the time I became an adult, it was very clear that I was never going to be an intrepid foreign correspondent. I just didn't have that thing in me, that the courage or the tenacity to do that kind of work, I don't think. But I still wanted to write. And the first job I got straight out of college, out of university, happened to be on a financial magazine. I just kept on going in that direction, never having really been that interested in finance. So I worked for Euromoney, which was the financial publication. And I worked on the sort of Eastern European magazine, and they sort of threw you in at the deep end. I was traveling to Romania, Ukraine, Bulgaria, all over the place, interviewing, finance ministers and things as, in my early 20s, which seems quite extraordinary now. And then later on, yes, I ended up on the money desk at the time. So that was more like the personal finance side of things, mortgages and tax and pensions, which sounds awful, but actually it wasn't. It was interesting because really you are still dealing with people's lives to some degree, to a large degree, to how people manage their money and how people cope. And so there was a lot about it that interested me. It did not make my heart race. And I knew that it wasn't what I wanted to do forever.
How did you get to grips with the kind of various complications of the financial world or the complexities of the financial world so that you could then kind of transmit them to a lay reader and make it, comprehensible in a personal finance capacity?
Well, I mean, it's what journalists do. You phone people up, you phone the experts up, they tell you something, and then you try and sort of decipher it, put it into, yes, layman's language, as you say. And that's a good skill to have, to be able to do that. And I mean, obviously you might do it badly or you might do it well. And some of those concepts are very complicated. And now if I had to, talk to you about derivatives or something, I would probably fail miserably. But yeah, that's what you do. You phone people up, you get the story. And in those days, it was very much phoning people up. It wasn't Googling, and then you have to lay it out in a way that is interesting and straightforward and will hold somebody's attention for 800 words or so.
Were you, at this point, working on fiction? We saw this line that you say you have dozens of unfinished novels on hard drives ranging from a few pages to tens of thousands of words long. Was that something that was happening at that part of your life, or was it later?
No, that was happening then. I used to write things on the side all the time. I had always loved creative writing at school and making up stories. I felt actually much more comfortable making things up than actually trying to write the truth, but had no confidence in any of it. I never studied creative writing and I had no confidence in it. And it always seemed the idea that anything would ever be published seemed quite far-fetched. But yes, I was always starting novels. I mean, those are, I should think, now lost to the world, tragically. But it was something that really interested me.
And then can we talk about the path to publication of your first book, The Money Goddess, and particularly the role that Lizzie Kramer played in making that happen? So I, at this time, was, working for The Times. I had a column. Yes, I think I was probably deputy money editor then. So I used to write the occasional editorial pieces. And I had written one particular one that Lizzie saw, and it was her idea that she wanted to get someone to do a book that sort of a straightforward guide to personal finance aimed particularly at women, because there was this sort of, it's probably still true now that women tend to leave the finances to men. They invest less, they save less, and all of these things have repercussions later on in life that you end up poorer later in life. So there was definitely sort of a gap there in the market for something, and Lizzie's very good at seeing gaps in the market. Anyway, she approached me, she phoned me up, and said, I've got this idea, would you be interested in coming in for a chat? And we could talk about it. And so I did that, and I ended up writing this financial guide, which is extremely out of date now, so please don't buy it. I will follow its advice. But yeah, so that was the beginning of my relationship with Lizzie Kramer, which has been, I think I've already said this, probably one of the most important relationships of my life. So, because we are still together, and she's been hugely important for me and has helped me with all my books in a way that I could barely describe, I think.
Continuing the Kramer line of questioning, we saw that she also came up with the idea for your first novel, a recession-era romance. I mean, that's quite a big genre shift from a personal finance guide. Why did she want to do it? And is it right that she actually kind of gave you a sort of schematic at the beginning to do that?
Well, I'm not going to remember the details of this. I think the idea actually came from an editor at Cornerstone. It was as they wanted somebody to write a rom-com, sort of in the Sophie Kinsella shopaholic kind of part of the market. And what they decided was to set it against the backdrop of the global financial crisis. They thought they had this idea that it was a young woman working in the city who falls on hard times. And so they came to me because Lizzie knew I wanted to write fiction, but wasn't really wasn't following anything through. And they thought because I understood the city that I would be able to write this book. And they gave me, I literally think it was 8 weeks. I keep saying it was 8 weeks. I believe it was 8 weeks. It was very fast. And I had to write. So they gave me the character and a basic, we would like her to lose her job, do a load of other crazy jobs, find love, those kind of things. Certain key points that I needed to hit. Off I went. And I did that. And it was published and it did sort of okay. It didn't sink without taste, certainly. And so then they came back to me, the publishers, and said, well, would you do us a heartwarming Christmas romance next? So I did. And then that continued. I wrote 4 novels in that vein. They didn't give me the plots and things for the other ones. They just said, could you do another one? I wrote 4 novels under a pseudonym, and they were allegedly romantic comedies.
And what appealed to you about doing them? Was it financial? Was it the prospect of getting a toehold in the fiction world? When they came to you with these ideas, because you've said it's not really your genre, what made you want to do it?
Not at all, but it was such a great opportunity to be offered a publishing contract, and there was this lovely sense of sort of safety about it in a way, because I didn't have to put my heart and soul on the page. It was like a commission. It was like a journalistic commission. It was like a ghostwriting project, which actually felt perfect for me at the time. It gave me that opportunity to sort of flex my fiction muscles to see if I really could do this, to see if I could actually sit down and write a book all the way through, which is kind of half the battle as a novelist. To just see it through to the end. That's, we talked about all my things that I kept starting and abandoning and kept starting and abandoning. And I think loads of writers do that. And part of it is just pushing through to the end. So it was an amazing opportunity. And I did really enjoy working on them. I mean, I never felt comfortable in the genre because it's just not me. I'm not funny or romantic. So I was a terrible match. But it showed me that I can do it. I could write. I could create a character. I could structure a novel. I could figure out a plot.
And the decision to do them pseudonymously, was that your call or the publishers, or did that come from the Times? And then what was the origin of Amy Silver, the name that you wrote under?
Oh, I mean, I think they suggested a pseudonym. I was very happy to do it under pseudonym because it wasn't my idea. It was that first novel in particular really was not my idea. It was theirs. And it would have felt really weird to me to put my name on it, actually. So I was happy, and I think we came up with a bunch of names, and then it was chosen by committee. It was one of those things,
as all great decisions are, by committee.
Absolutely.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, we published Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, in 2023. We're pleased to say that we have now put together a new and updated edition of the book, which now features contributions from more than 100 past guests on the podcast.
The book, which is available now, is the distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 7 years. It offers frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Alongside all the great guests we quoted in the first edition, the update includes new material from Harlan Coben, Victoria Hislop, Lee Child, Megan Nolan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Philippa Gregory, Joe Nesbo, Paul Theroux, Hisham Matar, and Bethany Hughes.
Published by Ithaca Press, the latest edition of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available from all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it. we talk now about The Girl on the Train and how the end of the kind of recessionista books and your journalism career kind of met to produce that book?
Yes. So, as I said, I wrote 4 of the Amy Silver books. At the time that I had gone freelance already and I was sort of withdrawing. I had sort of maybe lost my love for working in the newspapers, and I could see a way out. So I was thinking, well, I don't have to do this anymore. I can write these books instead. I can write books instead. Because the first 3 Amy Silvers did okay-ish. In fact, 2 and 3, I sold foreign rights, which is this great thing. You suddenly get money that you didn't know you hadn't expected to get, and they did quite well. So it was encouraging. It was enough to live on. And then the 4th one, which I took 2 years to write, sank without trace. It just did not sell at all. And then I found myself in some financial difficulty. And I was also pretty down about it then, because I realized, well, at that point, it felt like, actually, maybe I can't do this. This is not going to be what I'm going to do. And it felt like I'd worked really hard on that book, but it just hadn't come together. So I was at a pretty low point. All the while, while I was doing these books, I was and so conscious of the fact that it didn't feel right for me. I was coming up with crime ideas, and I'd had an idea about a woman whose sister is murdered, and she kind of investigates it. And that the woman who's the investigating sister, the one left behind, is a drunk and is unreliable. And that was my idea. And I'd been working on that, and I'd shown it to my agent, to Lizzie, and she'd loved the character. Around that time, a book came out, which I believe was called Sister, and was a huge bestseller and kind of had the same plot. And so I was like, damn, I can't do this. But in this dark point, that dark moment when I was thinking, I've got to get a real job. I can't carry on like this. I'm not able to pay the mortgage at this point. Lizzie said to me, you need to go back to one of those crime ideas. She said, do the drunk girl. The drunk girl is a great character. Go back to her. There is something in that. You'll find something in that. And separately, I'd sort of had a vague idea about a rear window-ish sort of thing where someone was going to see an act of violence and then, get drawn into a mystery, see an act of violence, possibly from a train. And then, so putting those 2 things together, I suddenly saw that I could get somewhere with it, because the drunk was the perfect unreliable witness on the train. And then it occurred to me that it didn't have to be an act of violence. She could see anything, because so much occurred in her head, and it was about her own fantasies and her own interpretations of things, which was actually perfect for me.
How much pressure did you feel under when you were writing it? We saw that you borrowed money from your family to make it happen. I mean, did you have a plan B for if it didn't do well?
No, I had no plan B. Well, I guess the plan B would have been to go back to journalism, to try and get some more work, freelance work. I didn't want to. I just felt like a complete failure and hopeless at this time. And a lot of that misery went into the novel. You can feel it. You can feel it in Rachel's self-loathing. So the great thing was that once I've sort of started it, and once I had only written probably a few thousand words, and Lizzie was like, you're onto something. I'm telling you, you're onto something. Push through this one. I keep talking about her, but she really did keep me on track. And without her, I don't think I'd have done it. I don't think I would have had the confidence to push through. And it was so important to have somebody. And I know not everyone will have an agent, but to have one person who really can be a ballast to you in those moments where you doubt yourself so much.
Well, I actually wanted to ask what the reaction was when you started to show it to people, both, you now mentioned Lizzie, but, also your publishers. Was the reaction kind of rapturous once you'd handed in the manuscript?
Well, I didn't. So when I started writing, I didn't have a publisher. So I was just writing it. Lizzie was the only person who saw it. She loved it. She was really enthusiastic about it. When I got about halfway through, I said to her, can you try and sell it? Because I just need the money. And it's not a good idea to try and sell a novel on a partial manuscript because, well, publishers don't like that. But she said to me, yeah, sure. She loved it. And she really believed in it. she showed it to a couple of editors, and they all came back going, yes, great, we want it. So there was a mini bidding war there. And then that was when suddenly the pressure lifted, because I suddenly had the money back. I knew it wasn't going to be a huge disaster. So that was amazing. But I was already sort of halfway through the novel, as I say, and I knew where I was going. I knew what I was going to do. So that was wonderful. And yes, there was suddenly this huge excitement from publishers, which was, I'd never felt that before. That was an incredible feeling that yes, I actually really can do this.
So The Girl on the Train was it was an enormous hit globally, sold more than 23 million copies, published in 50 languages. We saw that you broke a record held by Dan Brown for the number of consecutive weeks at the top of the bestseller chart. When we have talked to writers who have these huge successes, they often find it very difficult to pinpoint the series of factors that actually led to that happening, but also that they say that the experience can be, can be delightful, but also can be pretty challenging. And we saw that you described it as an overwhelming experience. Could you tell us, in retrospect, why you think it did so well? And then also, what was it like riding that wave?
I mean, I do think that there's a sort of mysterious alchemy about a book that becomes sort of a phenomenon. And it is difficult to pinpoint what exactly it was about that novel that that made it so. There are a few things that I could point to, and I think the character of Rachel, people really engaged with. They didn't necessarily like her, but there was something in her that people saw something of themselves in, or something that they could have been. There was a lot of people connected with that character, connected with the sadness and the loneliness in her, if not the drinking, but that a lot of people connected with that character. She was a very compelling character. You did want to follow her. There was the voyeurism, that sense of that thing that everybody did at the time. It doesn't really, now everyone's staring at their phone, but in those days you did sit on the train and stare out the window. And so many people had done not necessarily that commute, but commutes like it, and looked into the windows of people's houses and wondered what was going on in there, or imagined something going on in there, or perhaps had glimpsed something going. So many people sort of identified with that notion. So there were those things. I mean, I think the publishers did a fantastic job. There are all the things that publishers do to make sure a book is going to be noticed. And so you can't underestimate that. If you're lucky enough that your publisher really believes in your book, they will go a long way to make it happen. But there are all sorts of elements. The time it came out, I was lucky. You can't chase that. But I happened to hit a moment when those kind of books, that domestic noir that wave was just starting to rise, and I caught it exactly the right time without ever, you can't plan it, because you would never get everything done in time. But if I just happened to be at exactly the right moment, people were interested in those kind of stories, interested in stories of how marriages go wrong, and that the people next door might not be the people that you think they are. So there were all those kinds of elements. And yes, it was overwhelming. It was, you don't foresee something like that coming, and you don't know how it's going to feel when it happens to you.
And of course, it was then turned into a blockbuster film starring Emily Blunt. And, that must have been quite a surreal experience as well. But I actually wanted to ask a question that we put to everyone on the show. As you can tell, it's a preoccupation of ours. We always ask about money. How did The Girl on the Train change things for you?
Oh, well, it changed everything. And I can remember so clearly the sense of relief when I sold that book. And I didn't, we're not talking millions or anything like that, but I could pay off the credit cards. I could pay back my dad, from whom I'd only borrowed a few grand, but at the time it seemed huge, the wolf was no longer at the door. It was just the most extraordinary relief. And then obviously it then became enormous, and the scale of what I was standing to make gradually became clear, and that in itself it's a very strange thing to happen to you. But I didn't sort of run out and spend a lot or do anything like that. I'm not that I guess I'm just not that kind of person. So it was more than anything, it was a relief.
Could you tell us about the film adaptation with Emily Blunt? What was your level of involvement with that?
Very small. The rights to the novel were sold before it was even published. I was then, at this point, frantically trying to write the next book. I was very concerned about getting that second book, out, published, written as soon as possible. And I have never written for the screen. I don't know anything about it. So I said, very happy they take it. They do what they want with it. They did come to me early on and say, would it bother you if it's placed in a different location? And I said, no. I said I was okay with it. So I did the fun things. I went to the set. I went to the premieres. I met the actors. I did none of the work. And I think they did. I know people have problems with them moving it to the States, but I think they did a really good job with it.
I found it funny that one of the criticisms of them moving it to the States was that the gin and tonic in a can is a quintessentially British train experience.
I mean, it is. I do remember that being one of the questions I got asked most in the US when I first toured is, can you really get gin and tonic in a can? They were fascinated by the idea. I think you can now there, but at the time it was really exotic to them.
Who knew we were pioneers in that?
Another thing we often find with writers who've had a huge success is that following it up is challenging. It's the kind of classic second album syndrome. What was that experience like, with the example of Into the Water? What was it like going to work again, but suddenly with a completely different level of profile and expectations attached to it?
Yeah, that was hard. There was lots of things about writing that novel that were difficult. As I said, I'd actually started writing it before the Girl on the Train was published, but by that point I knew that the Girl on the Train was going to be quite big. And that whatever I did next was going to be noticed probably. And I felt an obligation, obviously, to my publishers. When it became clear that it was huge, that sense of trepidation grew. Also, I just didn't have time to sit quietly at my desk and write. I was touring all the time. I seemed to tour for almost 2 years, kind of nonstop. It was very difficult to just carve out that quiet time, which is so essential to me when I'm writing, to just sit at my desk, to not have distraction, to really immerse myself in what I'm trying to do. I think I rushed that novel. I rushed into to what I was trying to do with it. I was very ambitious with my whole, I'm going to write from 11 different points of view or whatever. I made lots of mistakes on it. And I still hold that there's lots about it that I love. But that was a really hard book to write. And the publication time was really, really difficult for me.
And so then, you mentioned making mistakes with it. What was your approach when you came to write A Slow Fire Burning in 2021? How did you go about it slightly differently?
I took more time. So Into the Water was 2017 and Slow Fire Burning was 21. So there's 4 years between those two books. Partly I took more time because I started writing something else first. I launched into a novel set on a tidal island, actually, which did not work. And then I ripped it up. This is the book I mentioned earlier. So I spent 9 months working on something which I then decided I couldn't finish, ripped that up. Then didn't know what I was going to do, but I didn't rush it. I explained what was going on to my publishers, who were very gracious about it and who knew that I'd kind of struggled with too. So I didn't feel like, come on, get on with it sort of pressure. And I took my time and I started thinking about these characters, a couple of characters that ended up in A Slow Fire Burning. I thought about those people. I worked on those people for a long time and I built the story much more slowly. And I did again it was quite a difficult one to structure, but I think it was just that I took the time I needed and I didn't rush it. And I really made sure that the characters were right and that the way I was telling the story was right. There were a lot of missteps at the beginning, but I think it was generally like acknowledging those missteps and thinking you don't have to finish this in the next month or what have you. You just take your time, you step back, get it right. Getting it right is much more important than just getting it finished at that point.
We also often get a sense when there's a book that's been huge that it can kind of create a slew of imitators and things like that. And you mentioned previously this book, Sister. I mean, it's my sense, I don't know if you agree with this, is that after Girl on the Train, there were a lot of like other books that were packaged to look quite similar and stuff like that. I mean, what was your feeling about, about the sort of rest of the world trying to kind of maybe redo what you'd done?
That happens in publishing, and it's not, I don't think it comes from the authors. It comes from publishing houses, who then, who like to jump on a bandwagon. If you go now, honestly, to a bookshop, you will see so many covers that look like Richard Osman covers. They're everywhere. Those are kind of like blatant rip-offs. I mean, the books themselves are probably really good and probably actually aren't that much in common with Richard Osman. But because Richard Osman is selling squillions, that happens. I think it happened with S.J. Watson as well. Before I Go to Sleep, there were suddenly a lot of covers that looked like that. It was really iconic, that cover. From a writer's point of view, it doesn't matter. Well, particularly to me, it didn't matter. I wasn't trying to do the same thing again. I was moving on to the next thing. I've never tried to sort of stay really too close to the novel I'd written before. So I didn't mind. It's flattering, I guess.
We're coming towards the end of our time. So I wanted to ask about what seems to be a kind of theme of your novels, which is, I hate the word difficult woman, but is in, complex female characters, maybe ones with kind of troubled pasts or things that they're working through. How do you create them, and how do you make sure that readers follow them throughout their journeys?
I think, so we've touched on it a little bit. It's that outsiderness. It's the people that don't fit, who aren't quite, for whatever reason, whether it's that they can't fit in, they can't find a way to, or whether they've chosen not to. But for some reason or other, they're not their life is not working out exactly the way we might expect it to. They either, have rejected societal expectations, or they fail to live up to societal expectations, or they have some sort of problem that means that they can't, operate as we might imagine they should. And those characters for me are fascinating. And that's where I think you have all the scope for conflict and interest. And I do like to present a character who's maybe not horrible, air quotes, likable, because that likability issue I just find strange, particularly in a crime novel. Why would you come to a crime novel for friends? These people are difficult. They're going through difficult things in their lives. That's why they're probably in a crime novel. Bad things are happening to them. They are in extremis. And yes, I write about women. I'm interested in women's lives. I'm interested in the way women are judged, often in quite different ways to the way men are, or how the expectations of them are different. And but those are the characters where I find there is scope for conflict and drama and interest. And I think if you write somebody who is really fleshed out and understandable and has, who's psychologically believable, then people will follow them, even if they don't like them.
With other extremely high-selling thriller writers that we've had on, people like Lee Child or Joe Nesbo or David Baldacci, we've had quite interesting conversations with them about their relationship with quote-unquote literary fiction, how they feel about it and how that kind of establishment feels about them. And one point that I think Lee Child told us, he was like, look, there's sniping, but the sniping never comes from the top people. He said, like, the people who he regarded as the sort of A-team of literary fiction writers were gracious to him, and, he was gracious back. I mean, have you had any experience of that kind of, game? And what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I love literary fiction. I read a lot of literary fiction. I enjoy a lot of literary fiction. Not all of it, obviously, because some of it isn't very good. There is wonderful literary fiction, and there's not less wonderful literary fiction. And I think I would agree with that Lee Child point. I've not felt people to be. I think if you see someone like Ali Smith, for example, who's an extraordinary writer, and she, for example, I know she loves Val McDermid's writing, and Val is the epitome of genre writer, is a great genre writer. And, I've had praise from people like Charlotte Wood, who's an Australian writer who I really admire. And she's got a book on the Booker list at the moment. And I know she likes a crime novel, and she has been gracious about my work and what have you. So I think people, really good writers, can recognize other good books, and it doesn't really matter whether because good genre fiction, it can be every bit as good literary fiction. It's just And there is real literary merit in lots of crime novels. And I mean, sci-fi, I'm not a big sci-fi reader, but I happen to know that there are lots of really brilliant, really literary sci-fi novels and romantic novels too. So it doesn't bother me too much.
And now to actually wrap up, kind of thinking big picture, do you think you'll stay in the crime thriller space, or is there anything else that do you actually deep down harbour an interest in science fiction and want to write that next?
I do not have the brain for sci-fi, definitely. That's a different brain, I think. I like this genre. It does sort of fit me. It suits my sensibility. It suits my preoccupations. I can't see myself going specifically to another genre. I might go sort of into the past a bit at some point, do something vaguely historical. But I don't have any plans to do that just yet.
Well, Paula, look, thank you for a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, and wishing you all the best with the Blue Hour and with everything else going forward.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Paula Hawkins. She's on Instagram at Paula Hawkins 2010. Her website is paulahawkinsbooks.com, and The Blue Hour is published by Doubleday. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the chat with Paula?
I thought it was very interesting how she clearly had this enormous success with The Girl on the Train. 23 million copies sold. But also that before that, there had been this very challenging period when she'd had this kind of unusual break into fiction writing on the back of a commission, really, as a journalist. And that had taken her in a certain direction, in a certain way, but then things weren't working out as well, things were difficult. And then this mega hit. I also thought she was quite sanguine on, the glut of books that were published afterwards that looked very similar in terms of the aesthetics of the cover and stuff like that. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, quite a novelistic story in itself, the genesis of The Girl on the Train, kind of borrowing money to make it happen and throwing everything at it, and then kind of being rewarded probably beyond her wildest expectations. Paula was very forthcoming, I thought, about the ups and downs of her career. I think the thing that stood out to me was the way in which she draws on her own personal experience. I mean, every writer does to some extent, but, the way she talked about drawing on her feeling of being an outsider from moving from Zimbabwe to the UK and how she kind of channels that into protagonists now, I thought was really interesting. Anyway, Simon, what have you been working on?
I was going to say also that the listeners to the podcast will not know this, but I definitely had bookshelf envy. She had some very nice looking bookshelves on there.
It was amazing looking office.
They were it was a great looking office, wasn't it? Like somewhere in Edinburgh, amazing fitted shelves, all of that. I mean, well rewarded, but yeah, she clearly has very good taste in internal fittings. What have I been up to? I have been grafting at my book, which is going okay. I'm on track with my big spreadsheet of when I need to get it done by. I'm trying to eke out another week to finish a week earlier, so I have another week to trim, basically, which I think is doable, but involves kind of, just doing a lot of work. I have been reading an extremely esoteric book about attempts to codify a minority Alpine language called Romansh for an article that I'm considering writing. And then on TV, I watched over the weekend Rebel Ridge, which is this new Netflix movie, which was very confusing. And I was pleased to see that there was a big article on Netflix's own website about the ending, because we didn't understand how the ending happened. And they had sort of cast this article as like, oh, here's a fascinating interview with the director about the sort of auteur-like genius that went into making his ending, but actually clearly indicated that we were not the only people who didn't know what was going on.
Indeed, yeah.
Anyway, what about you, Rachel?
The piece that I previously mentioned about the Magdalene Laundries and Island has gone live, and I'm now focusing on pulling all our end-of-year roundups together. And in terms of matters cultural, I've been reading Stoneyard Devotional, which is nominated for the Booker Prize, which I'm rattling through. It has a particularly haunting description of a mouse infestation. So for anyone who has been afflicted by that, it might be a little bit triggering.
You don't like mice, no. Rachel. It would be fair to say.
It has made my skin crawl remembering it all. And then in terms of TV, I've been watching The Diplomat, and as a kind of binge-worthy treat, I've been watching Rivals, the Julie Cooper adaptation on Disney+.
And what is your view on that? I've heard very mixed takes. A lot more enthusiastic than not, I would say. But
it's very fun, I would say. It's not, it's not high fiber, but nor does it try to be.
There was a fascinating piece in Private Eye, which was arguing that it was like essentially a kind of deeply meta piece of TV, because it's about like TV negotiations in the 1980s. Yet it's the sort of TV that could never have been put on in the 1980s because it's a lot more like sweary and sexual and stuff like that. It's said much more elegantly in Private Eye's remote controller column, but I found that was very interesting. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.